What is the most fitting case of vigilante justice you have ever heard of? A man in China, TX caught a guy assaulting his daughter and beat him so badly that he ended up dying. The father did however call 911 and a grand jury didn't indict him. All these stories about rapists getting their teeth kicked in or murdered, what about that badass that drove around his town spray painting dicks on all the potholes? That way the city was forced to repair them, not like they were just going to clean the paint and leave the pothole. Convicted child molester bragged to his cellmate what he did to his victim. Cellmate already in for life without possibility of parole is sickened by it and kills him. People in the area donated money to his prison account as thanks for ridding Earth of this monster. About 6 years ago in Portland, there was this homeless dude going around jerking off in front of all the lady homeless. So this group of other homeless dudes got sick of his shit, so they waited for him to go into a porta potty one day, then tipped it over on its door with him in it. Funniest thing I've ever heard. A man's son was abducted by his karate teacher and raped over quite a long period of time. The police caught him, and as they were bringing him through the airport, his father pretended to be on a payphone. When the rapist and police walked by, he turned around and shot the rapist in the head, killing him instantly. This was all caught live on the news. The father wasn't charged with murder, he received 5 years probation. The man's name was Ken Rex McElroy. He terrorized the small town he lived in for years. He was accused of regularly stealing from his neighbors stuff like livestock, gasoline, and antiques, robbery, harassing, assaulting, raping women too as young as 12, destroying property including burning down his wife's parents' house when she tried to leave him, assault, including shooting at least 2 people. He was charged with various crimes at least 3 times a year, but he had an incredible lawyer. Dude was only ever charged with anything once. He used to intimidate witnesses against him by following them or parking outside their homes and watch them until they were too scared to testify against him. That one time he was charged, by the way, he shot a grocer in the neck with a shotgun. For that he was given a charge of second-degree assault, max 2-year sentence, but he appealed of course and got out on bail. So he goes into a bar and loudly threatens to murder said grocer, who survived the shotgun to the neck by the way. All that did was get his trial pushed back. Anyway, so the town had a meeting, then a big group of them went to the bar where Ken liked to drink and shot him in the ducking head. It gets better though. The town sheriff was with the crowd just prior, advised them against taking action and suggested forming a neighborhood watch group, then told them he was going on a drive out of town somewhere. They left to go kill the rapist pretty much as soon as the sheriff was gone. Despite nearly 50 people on the scene when it happened, not one person other than the guy's wife said anything. They all either saw nothing or couldn't make an identification. A 15-year-old boy imitated a 14-year-old girl to attract the attention of a pedophile. When the pedo went to his house, the kid beat him up and called the police on the guy, all done while wearing a Spider-Man mask. Another case, Yadav, to quote the Wikipedia article, he was an Indian gangster, robber, home invader, kidnapper, serial rapist, extortionist, and serial killer. He terrorized a poor slum, to the point nearly every single woman in this community had been assaulted by him and daughters were just kept inside. He never got in trouble though because he bribed the police though, and only targeted Dalits, basically the untouchable caste in India. Seriously, the list of crimes is horrifying just skimming the article. It all came to a head when he turned his attention on a young woman who was studying to go to college and help the community. She stood up to him, and it ended with her threatening to blow up her own house if they broke in. She had called the police during the standoff but they never came. That was the last straw for the neighbors. A mob formed and chased off his men by stoning them and then burned down his house, and he went to the police to get himself arrested for his own protection. When they took him to the court for trial, a mob was waiting and he actually threatened them. The police did nothing. More than that, one of his accomplices tried to pass him a knife, and the police only stepped in after the mob protested that. Next day he was attacked and beaten, but he was rescued by the police. The police had no intention of actually punishing him, and set up his bail hearing in another city. Hundreds of women marched there from the slums armed with knives and chili powder. And, well, I think I will just quote the Wikipedia article. Yadav was then lynched by the mob of 200-400 women who showed up. He was stabbed at least 70 times, and chili powder and stones were thrown in his face. The chili powder was also thrown into the faces of police officers who guarded him. The police officers, overwhelmed and terrified, fled immediately. One of his alleged victims also hacked off his penis. The lynching occurred in Nagpur District Court No. 7 on the marble floor of the courtroom as he was being lynched. Yadav was horrified and shouted, "Forgive me, I won't do it again." The women passed their knives around and kept stabbing him. Each woman agreed to stab Yadav at least once. The mob continued attacking his corpse post-mortem. Yep, one of the most brutal lynchings ever. If you think it was not justified, I will quote one more part from the Wikipedia article about his arrival at the court, which I think sums up his character quite well. Yadav walked in and was confident and unrepentant. At about 2:30 to 3:00 p.m., when Yadav appeared, he saw a woman he had raped. Yadav mocked her, called her a prostitute and said he would rape her again. The police laughed. Even when faced with a mob of his victims, he was still mocking them. This monster only felt remorse when he was literally about to die. And worse, the police laughed. If that mob had any lingering doubts, that moment definitely made it 100% clear that the police would not do anything to ever see Yadav face actual justice. 100% justified. Vigilante justice at its finest. A guy caught a man raping his daughter. By the time the cops got to the scene, the man was bruised and broken and his face was unrecognizable. He told the police that he might have fallen down the stairs a couple times. They accepted that and arrested the rapist. Boy killed priest who raped him and his father by diving a crucifix down his throat. Fenix Jones, a real-life costumed vigilante in Seattle. Originally an amateur MMA fighter, he and later his team of other costumed vigilantes would patrol the streets of Seattle and stop crime, mainly assault and theft. A quote from his Wikipedia article. Jones says he wanted to take policing matters into his own hands after a few incidents changed his mind about Seattle. The first was when Jones says that his car was broken into and his son was injured after returning to the vehicle and falling on the broken glass. Jones was told that several people saw the break-in happen, but did not intervene. Later, Jones says that he encountered a friend being seriously assaulted outside a bar, and after calling 911 he put on the mask from the earlier break-in and made a commotion until the police showed up. And I thought, why didn't someone help him? There were 70 people outside that bar and no one did anything. Okay, not so dark and brutal as most comments here. Czech Republic had its own vigilante hero named Super Vaclav for a time. He sat in a park, and when dog owner did not pick up shit after his dog, Super Vaclav did it for him and spread it on owner's back, or putting out smoker's cigarette on bus stop with bucket or water, etc. It kind of broke my heart when I read it was probably all just some viral marketing stuff. In Texas, a guy's truck broke down a few feet from his house, so he had his two sons get out and push the truck to the driveway while he steered the car. A drunk driver came and hit the truck. The crash was so hard that the elder son, who was pushing the back left side of the car, the side closer to the road, had his limbs scattered along the road. The other son pushing the car also died. At some point after the crash and before the cops were arrived, someone came and shot the drunk driver with a gun. No gun was ever recovered from the scene, and when the father was asked whether he had a gun, he said he did but that he had lost it. All the cops could find in the guy's house was the empty holster and ammunition matching the caliber found in the drunk driver's body. When the crash happened, his neighbors came out to see what had happened. One called the cops about the crash and you could hear the gunshots in the background. Whatever happened between the crash and the arrival of the cops, his neighbors refused to speak. It is more of just justice, but there is the judge that comes up with punishments that fit the crime. A lady left a box of puppies outside, so he ordered her to sleep outside in a box. Grady Stiles Jr., aka Lobster Boy, He was an incredibly abusive husband and father. His daughter and her boyfriend actually pretended she was pregnant just so they could get married and she could leave the house. The day before the wedding, he shot the boyfriend in the back 3 times, killing him. He actually confessed at the trial and was found guilty of third-degree murder. However, the jail was not equipped to deal with his condition. He required a wheelchair due to his condition, and so he was instead sentenced to 15 years probation. He went back to being an abusive monster to his family, but was even worse than before. He regularly reminded them he got away with murder once and could do it again. Somehow he convinced his first wife to remarry him during this time, which I did say was the worst mistake she ever made. In the end, his stepson and possibly his wife, though they all claim she had nothing to do with it, hired a fellow circus performer to murder him because his entire family believed he would murder her. I am not exaggerating. In interviews for the ID show I saw about the case, every family member made it clear that if he lived, he most likely would have killed her at some point. It was not a matter of if, but when. His death is one of the only murders outside of self-defense that I think is 100% justified. Because the justice system already failed once, he might have been sentenced and found guilty, but they just put him on probation and house arrest. He literally got away with murder. If he had just gone to jail the first time, then his family would not be so screwed up now. I feel so bad for the stepson. He just wanted to protect his mom and now he will be in jail for the rest of his life. I think that is one of the worst parts of the case. His wife, stepson and the hired killer all got longer sentences than Styles' probation. That man never spent a day in jail for cold-blooded murder, and yet his wife and stepson are likely to rot in there for trying to protect themselves from him. When I was a baby, our family was in a bad car accident. My dad got out to check the other driver and he apparently stank of whiskey. Dad dragged him out the car and beat his head off the road. He admitted it to the police when they turned up, and the police apparently said to him, "So that guy must have hit his head on the steering wheel pretty hard then." Dad didn't get in any trouble, and the other driver was either too drunk to know what happened or was in so much trouble anyway he never pressed it any further. My first job was at a tire shop, and I worked with this older guy named Doug. He was around 60, the nicest guy I've ever met. One day at work, a guy and his girl got into a heated argument in our parking lot, and the guy slammed her up against his car. Doug and I saw it, and Doug just looks at me, with a tire iron in his hand, and goes, "1 second." He walks over to the guy, drops his tire iron, and slams the guy in the ground. He whispered something to him that I couldn't hear from where I was, but the guy got up and opened the passenger door for her and they drove away. Doug walked back over and just started working on a car like nothing ever happened. I will never forget it. A pretty infamous pedophile was released from prison in Ireland a few years back, and for weeks after his release, wherever he went there were stories of people beating the shit out of him till he eventually had to leave the country. No one else was ever charged for the beatings. I remember a newspaper article going around the internet about a junkie robbing a store. While fleeing, he was stopped by a few Marines on leave, and he stabbed one of them. He then ended up tripping and breaking both his arms, 7 ribs, his jaw and his nose, losing most of his teeth, and crushing his windpipe. There was a serial rapist on Street Thomas Usby a few years ago that was really scaring everybody. He predominantly targeted what we called expats, who are usually white foreigners coming to work service industry jobs. The locals rely almost entirely on tourism for income. So this is bad news and bad for business. There were posters everywhere for weeks. The docks, ferries, airport all had his face plastered all over the place so he couldn't skip islands. After a while I noticed there were not any posters anymore of him anywhere in the island. I asked a table of locals and they simply told me that the tide always washes away the trash. He apparently bragged about the rapes in a bar while drunk, and a couple guys offered him a cigarette to get him to step outside. They disappeared his ass and threw him in the ocean. TLDR, serial rapists in the Caribbean will straight up be murdered and thrown in the ocean. In my hometown, We had a town drunk named. He was in his 60s when this happened. He was slightly mentally handicapped and always walked home from the bar. One night, a group of teenagers grabbed him and beat him with a crowbar. Miraculously, T lived. Once the names got out of who did the crime, they all got out of because they were 16 with probation. A group of guys, most of them over 6 foot and big, found the boys one by one and beat the living tar out of them. Then, many of us in town donated and paid Alt's medical bills off, and the money raised paid for him to live in a nice apartment the rest of his life. Hands up anybody who has heard of the Earl Brigade. This was a Nazi unit recruited from convicts and guys released from asylums, and was so brutal that even other Nazis were disgusted by their atrocities. Their particular forte was massacring defenseless Slavic civilians, including murdering an entire kindergarten full of kids with bayonets. Evil bastards, to put it mildly. Their leader was convicted rapist, sadist and all-round unstable thug Oscar Earl. After the war he was captured by the French and imprisoned, where he reportedly died of war wounds. What is more likely is that some payback happened. Remember how Earl loved slaughtering Slavs? Earl's guards happened to be Polish. I suspect this choice of guards was entirely deliberate. The result was that Earl got beaten to death. Somewhere in northern Ontario, a few guys bagged the dude, sack on head, and beat him so bad he spent a long time in the hospital. Dude was physically abusing his wife and daughter. Cops came to the high school and questioned people. Everyone knew who did it, boyfriend of the daughter, but cops dropped all investigations soon after. My dad always tells me this story from when he was in college in NH. He was friendly with the cops in a small town. The story was that a well-known pedophile that attempted to kill himself by the ambulance picked him up, but just drove around until he died. No one missed him. Completely accidentally, I woke up to the sound of a table being knocked over in the living room. I figured that it was my cat and went out in my boxers to yell at him. There was a dude standing wide-eyed in my living room. My roommate used to have tons of parties. If dude had sat down, I would have thought that he was a guest who slept on the couch, but he bolted out the door. I chased. His mistake was running into the back parking lot, because there is nowhere to go from there. I caught him and a fistfight ensued. He was almost passive, only trying to block until I grabbed the wad of cash from his hand. Then, he started punching back. Soon, the sun came out. He ran off. I was so out of it. I pounded on my roommate's window to let me back in. I didn't realize that I was holding his wallet and keys that I took from the guy. I tripped on a purse that was dropped in my doorway. It was from his first victim. Rumi calls the cops. They just made jokes. Burglary investigator comes around that afternoon. I go down to look at mugshots. Turns out that they already had a suspect. Guy had just done 6 months for burglary in an adjoining neighborhood. He went back to jail. I lost a tooth and had a broken nose. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video and if you want to see more of Reddit Universe.